Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I'm going to bless you with my endgame plan for last Epoch's 1.1 patch. I've decided to league start as mana stacking Sorcerer, and this is a playstyle I enjoyed quite a bit about a year and a half ago. I had a really successful static orb build that had over 1,500 mana if I remember correctly. And some people took that build and managed to push really high corruption with it until it got nerfed to the ground. So I'm really happy that EHG are bringing back mana stacking to the forefront of Sorcerer because that's kind of the Sorc identity. And what I have for you here today is not just one build guide. I have 5 different build guides. I think mana stacking Sorc in 1.1 can have a lot of versatility. I see many different options that can be viable, and all of them achieving hopefully high corruption results. So I'll walk you through all 5 of my build concepts. I can't really go into as much detail as I usually do in my build guides just because I'm trying to fit 5 build guides into one video. So I will try to cover what makes each of these builds unique, how I envision fights to go for clear versus boss fighting, and what I think the strengths and weaknesses of each of these 5 builds might be. And the best part about mana stacking Sorc in 1.1 is that even if one of these 5 options turns out to be not as strong as we think it's going to be, it's pretty easy to pivot into one of the other 4 options. So I definitely think mana stacking is something that you should try in 1.1. It's going to be a lot of fun. Like I said, very versatile. Quite a few different options you can try within one single season. And that's always a lot of fun, right? Trying out different spells and all of them achieving decent results rather than just having one single build that rules the class. So check out the video and I hope you try one of these builds out, or at least get an idea for something that you want to try and make one of these builds your own. Alright, let me show you the 5 builds. Irashimase! So I'm going to start with the build that I think is least likely to be meta and to be smooth and to be successful. And this is probably going to be the build that I'm aiming to go towards as I build my character up, just because I want to spice things up. I've run a lot of the other existing builds that mana stacking has available for us already with previous patches, and I've really wanted to make Meteor be a viable main DPS source for a build for a very long time. It has been just so mediocre so far, so I'd like to give it a try. I want to make it work. The great news is we can always pivot to one of the other 4 options, like I said. And so how do I want to make this work? I want to make a build that revolves around Harbinger of Stars belt, and we get as many Meteor procs as possible. And to do that, obviously we need max crit, and we need many hits per second. And to achieve that, I'm considering using Static Orb with Orbital Fulmination and as many small orbs as possible. But also because it gives us lightning ages. You'll notice a theme across all 5 of these builds. I have lightning ages in all 5. And one major reason for that is 25% DR. I think you cannot skip 25% DR if you're running Sorc this season. It's just too strong to miss out on and too easy to get through either Static Orb or Lightning Blast or other sources. The idea here is during monos, you spam Static Orbs, you get a bunch of them to rotate around you, and then you just run around the map. As long as you have Static Orbs orbiting you, they're going to proc Meteors and everything around you is going to die. So this should be somewhat zoomy. You shouldn't need to stop too much to cast stuff, just because you can carry damage forward with you as you teleport forward or focus forward or whatever. That's always the best way to make a build zoomy through monoliths. And then when it comes to bosses, what I envision is you just cast Static Orb once for the damage reduction, and then you spam Meteor. And Meteor is going to proc more Meteors. And here you can see currently we've set it up to have 2, 3, 4. So 4 Meteors in the line. I haven't really finalized this setup for Meteor just yet. I think you have many different options. You can go for 6 Meteors total. You can drop the line. You can go for larger area in order to compensate for the smaller radius from Meteor Shower. Notice that here it says smaller radius, right? Minus 30% radius. And here it says larger area. Radius is much more important than area because area is a function of radius squared. So this is very punishing. Minus 30% radius. And if you put an extra point, minus 45% radius, That is extremely punishing. I'm not a huge fan of putting 3 points in here, but I'm considering it. I'm going to have to try different setups and see what works. Getting 75% fire pen is pretty much a must-have for Meteor. 90% crit multi is phenomenal. We already want to have max crit in order to proc the belt, so World Ender I don't think is necessary at all. And we even have base crit from Extinction anyways, so definitely avoid World Ender. It's a bit of a bait. Force of Impact is also super nice because it gives you stun chance and stun duration. Stun is very much underappreciated in this game, so if you get an opportunity to put an extra point here and there into stuns, it's great. The sad thing about Meteor is the percent more damage nodes are not great. So all in all, we're not getting too much more damage. So that's one of the main issues with Meteor, I'd say. It doesn't get much love for more damage multipliers, but it does get essentially more damage multipliers with the extra meteors. If you can have the meteors overlap, so especially against large hitbox enemies, you should be able to hit large bosses with 4 or 5 or 6 meteors in one cast. And that's essentially 500% more damage, right? In order to make that work, you definitely have to have increased area, as you're going to lose radius here. I'm not sure whether or not you'll be able to hit bosses and hit enemies in general with all of your meteors. So that's something that definitely requires playtesting, and so I'll be trying out different options and seeing what works best. Something else to consider is with the change to the innate for Sorc, you want to make sure your meteor costs at least 100 mana to get that 50% more damage multiplier from the Sorc innate that got changed recently. That's a massive more damage multiplier, right? Take that into consideration. It makes it easy to hit that with twin meteors. Alternatively, if you don't go this route, you could put points into Celestial Celerity. Now, is it worth it on a per mana spent? Probably not. You're not getting the DPS per mana by going from 40 mana cost to 100 mana cost. You're investing 2.5 times the mana to only gain roughly 25% more damage. So if you're only concerned with mana spent, that is a poor investment. Now, when it comes to the extra meteor, it's a better deal if you can ensure all meteors hit the same target. So definitely keep in mind that this meteor skill tree is not final. I'm going to be testing a lot of different things with it. I might even consider getting plus meteor skills in the chest piece to get more area, just to make sure that all of the meteors hit a single target. We also have a few different ways to recover mana, because spamming meteors obviously and triggering more meteors is going to be extremely costly. One of these ways is going to be Harbinger of Stars, giving you 12 mana gained on potion use for each meteor you have cast recently. In a 4-second period, I envision you being able to do at least 10 to 20, maybe even more meteors cast with a 3000 mana pool. And that translates to a significant mana regain when you pop potions. You can see we're also using a tier 7 mana gained on potion use, experimental affix. That should allow you to just chug all of your potions and get your mana back to full. So you're going to have 2 salvos against the boss, and that is going to be tremendous burst. You probably want to take into consideration the new ward mechanic that bosses have. So another option that you're going to have is if you dump all of your mana, you can just cast focus, and now that gives you 10% of your missing mana back, as well as this node right here, increased mana regen per missing mana. You know, that this is going to be generating a 3000 mana missing, which is on the high end obviously, but if you have that much mana missing, this translates to 240 mana regen per second. This node alone. So while you're regenerating your mana with focus, the boss's ward is decaying. So it kind of works out really well from a DPS cycle perspective. You DPS one of the boss's 25% chunks, and then you focus, get your mana back, and by the time you have your mana maxed out or even over maxed, the boss's ward is gone, and so you can take out another 25% chunk. Other than that, we also have Conveyance, just to give us a source of mobility instead of teleport. A little bit of haste doesn't hurt. And speaking of which, this could be a lot of haste if you have quite a bit of mana missing, because it says you gain haste for 1 second per 20 mana gained while channeling. So you just have to gain 200 mana to make this a 10-second haste. Absolutely phenomenal here. I think there will be solid synergy with focus, even though focus is a bit of a clunky skill overall. I know a lot of people don't love it, but there's great synergy between focus and mana stacking. The static orb setup I kind of already went through. Just make sure to max out your lightning ages, your Orbital Fulmination and Scatter Blast. Those are the most important ones. Then I got a little bit of Shock Chance and Projectile Speed. Then we have Arcane Ascendance. What do we expect from Arcane Ascendance? A little bit of extra procs of crits is what I've spec'd into here. And obviously you're going to be activating Arcane Ascendance for dumping your mana against bosses with Meteor spamming. And that's kind of its primary use case that I see. I don't see you using Arcane Ascendance for Monolith Clear unless you get into, I don't know, the boss fights in between monos, or maybe these Nemesis, the Harbingers. Those could be potential use cases for Arcane Ascendance. But other than that, yeah, you just want it to proc crits so that it procs more meteors. A bit of haste. It actually gives you a good amount of 24% more damage while you have it activated. And of course, we have Flame Ward as a defensive layer, which also provides offensive capabilities with 250% increased fire damage. But the most important use case here is defenses. Now those are the skills, and it kind of gives you an idea of how I envision the fight going. In terms of items, keep in mind these are all extremely aspirational items. So we're talking about very much endgame. And I'll be working on early game mana stacking Sorc setup to help you get to the end game here. But that video will be separate. So if you're looking for that, hopefully I can get it out tomorrow. But just want to set the expectations clear here. This is all end game builds. Don't expect any early game setups in here. So that's why we have Nihilus with tier 7 mana. I suspect it drops from the new Pinnacle boss because it has a big question mark on the drop. Obtain it from right here. It has 80 effective level for legendary potential. So getting 2 LP is unreasonable. But getting 1 LP is likely possible, especially with the new Nemesis system. You can throw your Nihilus into the Nemesis egg swap and get a 1 LP hopefully at some point. So why do we like this amulet? 12% max mana, 2 to all skills, even the mana regen, the more armor, and all resistances. All of those are just absolutely phenomenal bonuses. Current health and ward lost when you evade is a bit of a problem, but if you have insane amounts of ward, you don't really need to evade too much. You can just tank everything. So this is something that you want in your endgame setup. Alternatively, if you don't happen to have it, or if it turns out it's just too difficult to farm, another great option for mana stacking is Strong Mind, because it has flat mana as an implicit modifier, as a default modifier rather. And then it also has low effective level for LP. So you can very easily get a 3 OP Strong Mind. And I shouldn't say very easily, but it's certainly obtainable for most players after some grinding. And then Harbinger of Stars is obviously a core item for the build. And other core items, I'm not sure that anything else really is core here. You can probably make do with some weaker versions. Stormcarved is just an incredibly strong stat-wise item for what we're trying to get. 94 flat mana, 6 attunement is 12 more mana. It gives you lightning damage, lightning pen, shock chance, lightning and fizz res, just all around a great item. And here is one of the new items for the patch. It probably is core as well, just to get your crit maxed out. And it is Phantom Grip. It's a ring that is seemingly tailored towards minion builds, but just 2 of the lines for this ring. 2% flat crit strike chance, as well as 8% max mana. Those 2 lines alone make it worthwhile to use in our setup. So you can ignore every other line in here. Just focus on the 2% flat crit, 8% max mana. It's also effective level 50. 2 LP is certainly doable. It's common. You want to get int and strength in these rings because there is no max mana in the ring slot. It just scales well with the passives in the Sorc skill tree. It gives you ward retention. So int is just really powerful for all of these builds. You'll see would run a baseline of at least 120 int across all 5 of the builds. And then strength is to give you more armor. You can see we're running 68% armor mitigation. That's extremely solid. And you'll see these 2 rings. I have them in every single one of these 5 setups, including the channeling Disintegrate version. And you'll see why. These rings are super strong for what we're trying to achieve. If you were just getting the flat crit out of them, you might not want to use them, but the flat crit and the max mana are too good for this build. Other than that, I'm also using Blood of the Exile in all 5 builds, and I'm using it with tier 7 int. So you'll notice that I'm trying to keep a lot of these items, like the Stormcarved Testament, I'm trying to keep them identical across the 5 builds. just to make it easy to pivot from one to the other. If you happen to have this exact Stormcarved Testament, you can easily switch to the other builds by switching fewer slots than otherwise. Same with Unstable Core. I tried to keep it as much as possible tier 7 mana, tier 5 int. Even if you find the build that you love the most, you might still want to try one of the other 4. Just to experience them, just to see how they feel. And who knows, maybe even though you love what you're playing with right now, you might enjoy the other builds or one of the other builds even more. So I strongly encourage experimentation. That's something that I love doing myself. So I encourage you to try as much as possible. And that's why we're doing 5 builds in here. Now for gloves, I like high armor on the Eternal Gauntlets. Armor mitigation on dot is nice. Otherwise, again, mana int. And, you know, for the suffixes, it's not too important. I like stun chance here and there. You can see I'm running it in the wand as well. Mana and int are the primary stat lines that you want to focus on, as well as crit multi. And then make sure you have 100% spell crit. In this setup, I don't have too much spell critical strike chance. In like the wand, you can see I don't have it. In the skull, I don't have it. But that is mainly because of these rings, as well as the 6% flat crit on the catalyst, as well as the 150 int, giving us, as you can see right there, 435% increased spell critical strike chance. Those things on their own, just between these 3 flat crit bonuses and the int stacking, nearly maxes out our crit without much additional crit investment. For helmet, I like the base that gives you percent mana for obvious reasons. And then just between all of your affixes, max out your res. I just haven't tinkered around with the setup to get them maxed out. It's you know, for a build planner, it's not that important. You can max them out on your end. For the items across all 5 builds, I do recommend either the 3x1s that give you mana plus the percent armor obviously, or a 4x1 that gives you armor mana together with area. Area is probably the best bet that you have for these prefixes, especially for the Meteor version here that we're trying to do. We can also run a Throne of Ambition because it gives us essentially 40% more fire damage. We're running a fire as main DPS source and more armor. So more survivability. You can ensure also that you have your max reduced damage taken from critical strikes. So that's a must-have. Decent retention for ward. Blessings are somewhat straightforward. We want crit multi, max mana, all res, and armor. There's only one question mark, and that is whether you want to get fire res shred in this slot. I would recommend against it for this version because we have 75% fire pen, and fire res shred is additive with fire pen. Now let's look at the passives, and the passives are where we're gonna get a lot of our survivability layers. Mage passives, they're not too complicated here, and you can even move these around. Extra cast speed just for bosses to get our meteors out faster. What I want to highlight here is wisdom at 6 points. It gives us 5% mana regen per 100 max mana. If you can get 3k max mana, this is 150% mana regen, which translates to 12 mana per second. An extremely high value 6-point investment. I would not put any more points into it. Here we also have ward per second per max mana. You probably don't need to necessarily put 8 points in it, but at 5 points with 3k mana, this is 300 ward per second. And then again here, ward gain per 15 current mana if you use a skill that costs at least 40 mana. If you have 3000 current mana, let's say, every single meteor cast at that much mana is 1000 ward gained. So you can see we have quite a few options for ward gain and mana regeneration thanks to our high mana stack pool. Another great benefit here for having over 1k mana is Archmage. It essentially refunds 20% of the mana cost of every single skill cast once you have over 1000 mana. And it gives you 15 spell damage. Meteors that cost 100 mana are going to give you 20 mana back. So they're still going to count as if they're costing 100 mana, but give you that 20 mana, so that net it's 80 mana altogether. Here we're taking Dragon Breath primarily for the increased area. We definitely want the meteors to be able to overlap and have multiple meteors hit the same target. Mana Well is a must-have for the 15% max mana. The mana gained as ward is just a nice side benefit. We don't need CDR from Recollection. Other than that, the cast speed here is nice. Don't care about 5 spell damage too much. 50% crit multi is a solid investment for 5 points. Don't need the crit strike chance, especially because we're not running a lightning damage build. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is Calculated Destruction, obviously must have. Make sure to get 5 points in here, and then 5 points in Arcane Momentum for cast speed with some investment in Essence to get the 10% MS. Now Arcane Insight I'm on the fence about this one. With 150 int, this gives us 750 ward decay threshold, but honestly, I'm not sure that we need it. As I was mentioning in my other video, ward decay threshold does not play into the ward decay formula. So because of that, I don't see too much value in ward decay threshold, but the int for int stacking is a decent option. On the Rune Master side, we're just getting a bit of int and damage reduction for catalysts. And again, even more ward gen with int from Arcane Focus. They nerfed this with the most recent patch, but it's still solid. So those are the passives. And since I'm going through this first build, I went into them in a little bit more detail. But for the next 4 builds, I'll definitely be zooming a little bit more. So that is build number 1. Meteor as the primary damage source and Static Orb as a utility support skill together with Focus, Arcane Ascendance, and Flame Ward. The second build is quite a bit different. It's actually a channeling Disintegrate build. And the only reason we're actually considering mana stacking is Hyperfocal, which gives us 1% lightning damage per 8 max mana. At 3,200 max mana, I'm just picking that number because it's easier to do the math, this is 400% more damage, so it's 5 times the damage. And of course, we're losing 60% damage to get no channel cost, so it's 5 times 40%, so it's actually double damage only, if you take into account that we just lost 60% of damage here. If you have a more realistic, let's say 2400 mana, you're looking at, between these two nodes, a 1.6 times multiplier. So that's something to take into consideration. This is a solid boost, but also keep in mind that you have no channel cost, so you can easily afford a twin beam, which is a 1.4 times multiplier for damage, just because you lose 30%, so you're down to 70, but you times 2 beams, so 70 times 2, 1.4x the damage. And then you have a little bit of extra damage multiplier from Searing Plasma as well. More damage multiplier here in terms of, it's a 1.6 times. And then we get into Disintegrate Tier 2 and Tier 3, something that has always been incredibly clunky, but with this patch we get Lucomancer, and more importantly, Resurgence, where if we have 2 stacks of Lucomancery, we get to keep the tier 3 status when we move over. Let's say you teleport to a new location, you can retain that tier 3 Disintegrate. So this should be a lot smoother, especially, for both clearing and boss fighting. This is the way to go. You make sure to get your Resurgence and your tier 3. Intensify would be really nice, it's just we ran out of points. The greatest weakness of this build is going to be survivability, because we're staying in one place, so it's much easier for enemies to damage us. So Galvanized Defense, I think, is extremely high value. I would recommend taking this, hopefully even getting 4 out of 4 points. You could take 1 point out of Tendrils, probably, and get Galvanized Defense. Because the greatest bottleneck for this build is definitely going to be survivability. The damage side, as you can see, you have so many multipliers to work with between everything that you have in this skill tree. I think damage-wise, Disintegrate is going to be great. Not to mention that you have even extra more multipliers from the gear, which you're going to see in a second. We also have Lightning Blast, but the primary purpose here is just for Lightning Aegis and a little bit of ward gain. I don't expect Lightning Blast to be doing much damage. Just get your Lightning Aegis for 25% DR and then extra ward. Arcane Ascendance here, I don't see too much value in it, I'll be honest, but it's for more procs of Lightning Aegis, but also 24% more damage through Chronoclasm. But overall, Arcane Ascendance, you can change to something else that you prefer. Flame Ward, standard here. Teleport, you can do whatever you want with. Here's an example of what you could do with it. Just cooldown, buff duration, etc. For the itemization, and this is where you can see we've dropped some of the mana compared to the previous setup for Meteor. We're only opting for 2.9k mana, and that is primarily because we are running Ignivar's Head. And despite the nerf of the combo between this item and the Gambler's Fallacy Amulet, this item still has the line that says Disintegrate deals more damage equal to your spell crit chance. And that bonus works even if your spell crit chance is above 100%. So here I've gotten it up to 185, that's obviously on the high end, but with 185 spell crit, that's 2.85 times your damage. So it's a great more multiplier to work with. It's definitely the best in slot item you can consider, and it actually synergizes extremely well with the Phantom Grip ring that we were using for the previous build. So you can see this is a very similar ring. It's slightly different in that we have increased elemental dot at tier 7 and tier 5 int. Same thing here. But really, if you happen to just have the tier 7 int, tier 5 strength rings, it's totally fine to slot that in here as well. For this build, you have 4 stat lines that actually compete with each other that I would prioritize, and that is max mana, int, so those are the same as previously, but also spell crit chance because it translates to a more multiplier, and increased elemental dot. The increased elemental dot is just a stat line that is far better than other increased damage stats. So focus on those 4 stat lines when you're setting up your character. You can see these boots are the same, this armor is the same, and we're also running Peak of the Mountain for obvious reasons, right? 290% crit chance translates to more damage. It's fairly doable to get a 4 LP peak. The amulet is also the same, so if you happen to have a Nihilus with tier 7 mana, that's applicable to all 5 builds. On the idols front, we've only changed the 2x2 with a double lightning damage idol. Blessings wise, we're getting even more crit chance for the more multi. And then we did opt for Lightning Rest Shred here instead of the max mana. Taking off the max mana hurts. That's one of the reasons we're sub 3k. But Lightning Rest Shred is just super high value here because we don't have any Lightning Pen. And we do have hits coming from all the Lightning Blasts. So we should be able to get 10 stacks of Lightning Rest Shred. Especially if you activate Arcane Ascendance. That's another way of getting extra Lightning Zaps. So that's one change. Otherwise, we're also running all res armor, and then we switch to armor while channeling. As I mentioned, survivability is going to be the biggest issue with this build. You can see we're running slightly less armor, but also we're stationary and we don't get the benefit of lost knowledge. We still get max mana giving us word per second, so this is solid, but lost knowledge being gone hurts quite a bit. We also opt for the lightning pant with rift bolt, but one thing you can consider for this build is mana bulwark. The reason I've opted against going for damage dealt to mana before health for all 5 of these builds is because a lot of them are stacking very high amounts of ward while also keeping your health at a very low amount. So if the enemy has managed to go through your ward, you're likely dead anyways. Getting mana bulwark and trying to stack damage dealt to mana before health, which is a prefix so it competes with int and max mana stacking, trying to get this stat line buffed up is very tricky. I'm not sure that you're going to get much value out of it. The only build I would probably consider it is this Disintegrate build, because the Disintegrate build is the squishiest out of all 5. You can think about this. If you feel squishy, it's an option. We are running 3k mana, and also we are running Disintegrate, which costs nothing, and we're going to have 28 mana regen per second while channeling. So remember, channeling now does not disable mana regen. We're gonna have a ton of leftover extra mana, so diverting some of the damage coming into mana is something you can consider. It's just tricky given that we also want to be running ward. You can think about mental ages, which actually absorbs damage before ward is fully depleted. It actually protects your ward. And obviously we're not running Harbinger of Stars. We're just opting for a armor belt here, and you can see I'm missing a suffix. You know, just do whatever you need to get your resistances maxed out. Always max your resistances. I think that's pretty straightforward, which is why I haven't bothered putting some of these suffixes. Always max your reduced bonus damage taken from crit strikes. Very high priority stat lines to max out, and then work on that crit as mentioned. Don't worry about the crit mod. Something else that I want you to consider here is I've actually put 5 points into Flamewalker. I don't think it's going to be phenomenal, but I just wanted to showcase it. You can take it out if it doesn't work well for you. It is an alternative source of lightning and fire and cold rest shred because of your fire auras. For example, here you can convert your fire auras with Flame Ward with this single point. All of your fire auras globally become lightning auras, and then they're going to be doing lightning rest shred at 50% per aura per second. 2 auras are going to stabilize at around 4 rest shreds. So if you can get up to 5 auras stacks, then you have 10 rest shreds and you don't need to worry about actually getting this lightning rest shred. You can switch it to mana. Keep in mind, Ignivar's head gives us fire aura area, so it makes it easier for that rest shred to be applied, and it gives us fire aura every 2 seconds while channeling. So I don't think this is an ideal setup. You probably do 2 or 3 fire aura stacks. You might want to consider taking these out, but I just wanted to showcase this interaction as an alternative source of your rest shred stacks so that you can save your blessing for something else. Keep that in mind for different setups of Sorcerer and Rune Master. The third build is essentially your typical Glacier as a main source of DPS, with Static Orb as a support, as kind of a utility spell, basically just giving us static armor. So we're going to be dishing out most of the damage with Glacier. That's kind of how I envisioned this build. This is going to be probably one of the best ways to level just because Glacier's setup is pretty straightforward. If you get enough mana, it becomes self-sustaining. And until you get it to self-sustain, you can just take 1 point out of Cold Snap, reducing the mana cost to 34. And so 34, giving you critical rejuvenation, percent of max mana gain. You can probably sustain this indefinitely with around 1500 max mana, maybe even less. And once you get to the 2 to 2,500, you can get an extra point in Cold Snap. The reason I'm going for skipping the third and largest explosion and just focusing on the middle explosion is once you get Cold Snap, that's 3xing the damage of the mid explosion. That makes it so that it's actually better than the largest explosion already because it's 3 times 175. It's 50% more damage than the largest explosion. Not only that, but also the bonuses on a per point basis that you get for middle explosion damage is much better for these other nodes. This one gives you 20% per point. This one gives you 35. So the middle explosion just scales much better because of these points giving you better stats. Ideally, you'd max this out if you can find a few more points. Don't worry about the mana efficiency here. I would actually discourage you getting more points into it because you reduce the mana cost of Glacier, and that actually reduces damage because of the new innate for Sorc. If you get enough max mana, mana isn't going to be an issue. You're going to sustain Glacier indefinitely. Reversing the order makes the damage come out a little bit faster because your medium explosion is going to come first, but you can take this out if you want and then save a few points from the Frost Grip. I actually like the stun chance in Frost Grip, so I don't mind getting 3 points here and 1 point here, but you could get a little bit more damage against bosses by rotating some points around. That's the Glacier setup. Static Orb setup's pretty straightforward. Get your lightning ages and not much to worry about there. Arcane Ascendance. This is primarily just faster cast speed, 50% to burst bosses with, as well as 24% more damage against slowed enemies. So try to have a source of slow. You're not going to be fighting distant enemies with Glacier. It's a very short range skill. See if you can get a source of slow from your item slots perhaps. But yeah, this is pretty straightforward. Teleport, pretty straightforward. The way that I imagine teleport working, by the way, is getting a point in mirror image should give this a minion tag. I don't know why it doesn't in this build planner, but it should get the minion tag, which should then get +4 level 2 minion skills from the 2 phantom grips. So synergy right there with teleport. But if it doesn't get the minion tag, make sure to take this out. And then Flame Ward, pretty straightforward again. So that's the skill setup is nothing too surprising. Like I said, Glacier is probably the easiest way to set up mana stacking this season because it requires the least investment to become online. So you may want to consider this as your leveling option. Again, I'll do another YouTube video for leveling guide. In terms of items, because Glacier gets 8% base crit for free here, we don't actually need the 6% base crit in the offhand, so we actually opted for 4% crit multi. Everything else is fairly similar. I changed the Harbinger from the first build to a Strand of Souls. 70% ward retention is great. 180 mana spent gained as ward is nice as well. That ends up being around 100 ward per cast. It's definitely a solid option, Strand of Souls. But otherwise, everything is fairly similar. We are running a lot of mana. We're running probably too much mana because this build doesn't benefit on the damage side from mana. Mana is just a defensive layer for this build. You can get, the Lost Knowledge, the Mana Shell, and just in general, tons of defenses from mana stacking. We're prioritizing getting a bit more area because Glacier is an AoE skill. We do opt for the Cold Pen here because we don't have too many other sources of cold penetration. Idols are fairly similar. Throne of Ambition works because we're dealing cold damage. Blessings, crit multi-mana, same as before. All res. Here we actually did get the Cold Res Shred instead of the armor, and then armor. So I suspect this build is going to be incredibly tanky, similar to the Meteor one, but even more so because mana is not going to be an issue whatsoever for this build. You can spam as much Glacier as you want. This is going to be the easiest build to execute once you get past a certain threshold of max mana. You can just keep spamming your Glacier and it's going to give you infinite ward as per usual and tons of tankiness, 25% DR from the Static Orb, giving you lightning ages. So overall, this is likely the smoothest and easiest gameplay out there just because mana is a non-issue and you can just focus on getting damage and getting survivability. as soon as you pass a certain threshold of max mana. So that's the third build, primary source of damage being Glacier and Static Orb being a utility support spell. Now check out the fourth build. The fourth build, skill bar looks incredibly similar, but we've flipped things around. Now Static Orb is your primary source of damage and Glacier is more of a support skill. And we don't anticipate Glacier to be your primary source of damage. If you actually spec into 3,500 mana, which is obviously ridiculous, but if you get that much, mana charged converts your max mana into mana cost and gives you damage per 20 max mana, as well as overcharge detonation, giving you orb hit damage per 1 mana cost. This makes the mana cost 700, so this gives you, a 15x damage, no big deal. Altogether, these two at 3,500 mana give you about 150 times the damage from just 2 nodes. And then we have crit multi bonuses in the skill tree, a little bit of extra more damage, a little bit of extra more damage here, and even extra hits from the smaller orbs. Those counts as extra damage as well. This is one of the craziest burst damage skills in the entire game. The only downside is mana recovery. And we're helping manage that mana in 2 different ways. One is with Teleport Mana Tunnel. Once every 5 or 6 seconds, once you have enough CDR, you get to cast a Static Orb and then all of that mana cost is refunded for you. Not to mention that you get an extra 20% refund because of the passive tree. So you get 120% of that 700 mana cost back. So it's a great way to manage your mana with this expensive Static Orb. It also gives a stun immunity, which is nice. More importantly, you want to make sure to reduce the CDR of teleport as much as possible if you're ever running Mana Tunnel. And so this is one way to manage mana, the 20% mana refund from the passive tree together with this mana refund. But we also have Glacier, and you have 2 different options on how to run Glacier. You can leave it at over 40 mana cost in order to be able to proc the passive here, Lost Knowledge. So it's going to be a great defensive option. Spamming Glacier, it's going to give you tons and tons of ward, while at the same time giving you back 1% of your max mana for every hit. And keep in mind, if you get 3 Glacier hits because of the small, medium, and large explosion, this should proc 3 times on enemies that get hit by all 3 of those. So this is a great way to gain your mana back. Another way to spec this is if you just put 1 point into Lesser Glacier, mana cost all of a sudden becomes 10. So now you don't proc the extra ward gain, but it's an even better mana regeneration. I think the better option is to go to keep it over 40 mana cost, stacking as much mana as possible so that you get as much mana back from critical rejuvenation as well as cold victory. And otherwise, I've just spec'd it into middle explosion damage. And so that's the Glacier support setup. Arcane Ascendance, similar as per usual. Just get the extra damage from Chronoclasm and Arcane Ascendance. I don't see it to be too high of value. It will give you higher cast speed though, so that is better mana recovery through Glacier. And that's about it. Then you have Flame Ward. So that's the skill setup for the 4th build I wanted to highlight here. In terms of itemization, we are opting for a wrong wrap. It gives us even more CDR for teleport, so more mana recovery, more mana refund, that is, with Mana Tunnel. And the 35% MS is great. This is going to be very zoomy. We're also running Strand of Souls, 180% mana spent gained as ward for a 700 mana cost. Static Orb is going to be 1.5, 2,000 ward every single cast, together with the other mana spent gained as ward sources. Every single cast of whether it's Glacier or Static Orb will result in a ton of mana. We are also going to have significant burst against bosses with this much mana to work with. That is 5 or 6 casts of Static Orb. Make sure to max out your crit as per usual, and then we're just stacking mana and int. In this build, stacking mana is even more important. Here's a quick spreadsheet that highlights, as a function of your max mana, how much your damage is multiplied by because of those 2 nodes that I highlighted. So you can see at 3,500 mana, as I mentioned, we get about 150x the damage. If you just lose 300 mana, that is a 17% loss in damage because you go from 150x to 129x. If you go all the way down from 3,500 to 2,000 mana, that is a loss of 3x the damage roughly. So mana stacking, as I've mentioned in an old video, the benefit for Static Orb from mana is a quadratic function here. It's not linear, it's a quadratic benefit. That's why you can see as we double our mana, we roughly quadruple the damage. That's why mana scaling is so much more powerful for this build. And you want to get as high of mana as possible. All the other builds, even the Disintegrate one, while they benefit for damage from the mana stacking, they don't benefit nearly as much as Static Orb's damage. They benefit more so on the defensive side for mana stacking for the other builds. Idols and Blessings are pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to go over them. The one thing I will highlight on the passive tree side is that we are investing into 25% CDR with Recollection. I think most of the other builds did not get these 5 points because CDR just isn't as impactful, but we definitely want it for this build. And so for the fifth and final build, we have a sneaky one here. What we're trying to accomplish here is we want to take advantage of Arcane Current, giving a Spark Charge chance with 40 mana cost skills. So the concept of this build is, can we get Frostclaw to actually cost 40 mana? Because it's hands down the best way to get hits on enemies with a single cast. It already has 3 projectiles by default. This node adds another 2, so 5 projectiles. Volley of Glass makes it so that all 5 can hit the same target. And then on through the snow gives us a second essentially cast of Frostclaw behind the target. So that's another 5 hits, theoretically, if the target is large enough. Then Ever Onward gives you a 3rd cast, and then a Crack in the Ice, a 4th cast. So 20 hits total if the target is large enough. Obviously, most target you're not going to be hitting 20 times. But altogether, this is hands down the best way to apply static charges with a 40 mana cost skill. So what is the math around that? If you go to Frostclaw, it costs 12 by default. This is plus another 2, so 14, 18, 22, and then 24. So that is the flat mana cost of 24. And then you get another 30% mana cost increase, as well as another 90% mana cost increase. So that means we're gonna multiply the mana cost of Frostclaw by 2.2 times. So whatever the mana cost happens to be, if it's 24 times 2.2, that results in 52. But keep in mind that our weapon, if it's a wand, now we're using dagger here for that actual reason, but if it was a wand, it would decrease mana cost by 3 to 5. And so if you get down to, let's say, 18 mana cost, that actually ends up giving you 39.6 mana cost for every single Frostclaw. So I don't know if this rounds up to 40 or not. I don't know if it's gonna pass that threshold of 40 mana cost skill. This is something that we need to test out. Depending on how that works out, we may need to go for a 20 mana cost Frostclaw, which then guarantees a 44 cost overall. But the reason I had 18 is because Gift of Winter, reducing mana cost by 6, is actually incredibly valuable for the second line of chance to get 12 mana on direct cast. 36%. This will give you back 4 mana per cast. So it's a decent source of mana regeneration. So if it happens that 18 is actually not working with the 40 mana threshold, make sure to just take 1 point out of Gift of Winter. Other than that, in this skill tree, we just convert to lightning damage. Make sure to get as much cast speed as possible so that we can spam more Frostclaws and get more Spark Charges. And otherwise, we're not expecting to deal too much damage with Frostclaws, so we're not opting for some of the damage nodes in here. So it's pretty straightforward. If you need extra points, just take them out of here. You know, you have plenty of points in this current setup. As I mentioned previously, I always want to have a source of lightning ages. So we are running Lightning Blast primarily for the lightning ages, but also because lightning ages also apply spark charges. Not only that, it also detonates existing spark charges. So Lightning Blast is a great support skill for the Frostclaw setup that we currently have. It also generates some ward for us between these two nodes. Arcane Ascendance for the cast speed and the usual extra damage, and also more Lightning Blast. And then Focus for mana regeneration, but also for mobility. This is the main reason we have Focus. Teleport is another option. If you happen to find that you don't actually run out of mana, you can consider going Teleport instead of Focus. And the way that we benefit from Lightning Blast is with Dragorath's Claw. It gives you a 47% chance to cast Lightning Blast on crit with Frostclaw, up to 3 casts per second. So this is how we're going to get our lightning ages. But the dagger itself is phenomenal overall. Gives you 4% flat crit, gives you 40 spell damage, gives you all res, gives you spell crit multi. Even the ward gained on crit with Frostclaw. All of this is just crazy high value. And obviously the low spell damage flat is not an issue because we're running Fragment and we're stacking 180 int. So we have 360 lightning flat damage, which turns out 360 flat lightning damage is pretty good. And then increased spark charge explosion area, is solid. Obviously, we want to be maxing out our crit chance, and it makes it incredibly easy to do that with the between the Dragorath, between the 2% flat crit from the rings, as well as the Sorc passive giving you 180 int times 3% crit chance. It shouldn't be too hard to get max crit. We're still running Strand of Souls here because of the ward retention and the mana gained as ward, but everything else is pretty much the same as some of the other setups. Same boots, same relic, same amulet, same helm, and I think it's the same gauntlets. Oh, actually, except in all of these items, I think I flipped around the tier 5 and the tier 7. I opted for tier 5 mana and tier 7 int. So mana is actually not a direct driver of damage for this setup. Mana is more of a defensive tool. So we don't need to drive it as high as 3k. 2k is totally fine. And then you can spec more into intelligence, which is directly going to impact your DPS. For passives, obviously we're running Arcane Current. And by the way, Arcane Current is another great option if you're finding you're not proccing as many meteors with Harbinger of Stars. For the first build that I mentioned, if you really want, you can spec into 4 points of Arcane Current, and that will give you extra crits for extra meteors. Definitely something worth considering. But for this particular build, we have a lot of synergy with 40 mana costing spells. So every single Frostclaw is going to be doing so much for us, giving us ward, applying spark charges, and just giving us tons of value overall. Mana regen is sitting at an insane 26 per second. So you can afford to spam quite a few spark charges before you run out of mana. You may not even need, as I said, the focus. You could even switch to teleport. We'll have to play it out and see how it feels. You even have 5 unspent points to play around with. The main concept that I wanted to highlight here is running spark charges with a 40 cost Frostclaw. I think the only question mark here is they added this no burst line on Volley of Glass. I'm not sure how exactly this is going to work out. The no burst line might be quite punishing for clear with Frostclaw, but for single target, I still think Frostclaw applying spark charges should be just crazy high DPS. The idols are just slightly different. 3x1s, 4 of them, all of them giving mana and armor. And then we're running 2 1x3s that give you cast speed while you have lightning ages. And then the suffix on these is pretty horrendous, so we just went for 30% lightning damage. No big deal there. 38% cast speed is quite a nice upgrade between these two idols. For blessings, crit multi, lightning rest shred. We don't need the max mana as much, so definitely lightning rest shred is best in slot here. All res, armor. Pretty standard there. And as usual, I mean, I haven't perfectly maxed out the res, but make sure that you do. You have options on where to get extra res. The gauntlets, you don't need the stun chance. You can definitely get res here and there. And obviously always max your reduced bonus damage taken from crit strikes. These are just reminders for your builds as you're progressing. And then if you have extra slots that you don't know what to do with, just spend them on armor, in terms of suffixes that is, once you've maxed out your res. And you can see here I'm running a solid 62% armor mitigation with some of that applying to damage over time as well. So there you have it. 5 different aspirational builds that you can aim towards or itemize towards as you progress with your Sorc mana stacking setup in 1.1. All of these, I think, are going to be viable at a very high corruption at that. Some of them may be able to do higher than others, but I truly believe all of these should be 1000 corruption viable. We'll see how things shake up though, but at the end of the day, I definitely encourage you to experiment, try things out with the new patch, especially focusing on these brand new patched opportunities for us within the Sorc, Shaman, Forge Guard, all of these skill trees that have been changed up. And like I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on my next stream on how I envision the early game should look like for a mana stacking Sorc and how we can get from, let's say, level 50 all the way up to level 100 with starting to work towards all of these items and having at least a 1,500 mana stack to work with before we just start grinding and knocking down one of these items at a time. And hopefully I have enough time to make a YouTube video about that early game process as well. And so with that said, I'm going to get to work on finishing up this video so that we can move on to the next. So if you got to the end of it, I know this is a long one. I had to fit 5 builds into one video. I'm glad I did it. I hope you're as excited as I am to try out as many different setups for mana stacking as possible. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. I'll see you on Twitch or in the next YouTube video. Take it easy and go chiso sama deshita.